Very well. I've waited for my 1 minute, so let us get started on this second day of the SACIM meeting, the September virtual meeting, on this day of the equinox, the autumnal equinox, when we have the balance between light and dark. Also, the second day of Sukkot, where we should be inhabiting the experience of being vulnerable, particularly in partnership with all of the mothers and babies and families that are vulnerable in our country. We will start with some business activities. We did not approve the minutes at our meeting yesterday, so would somebody move approval of the minutes from our June meeting?
So moved. This is Magda.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right, we have a movement and second. And we don't have bylaws, so I don't know if we have a quorum, but and I know there are a few members missing. But any discussion on the minutes? All right, hearing none, all in favor, just wave at me if you approve. Any disapprovals? Now wave. All right, they're approved. Very good. So now let us move into our agenda, and the first item is some of the organizational issues. So I know Lee had brought that up at our last meeting that needed a little time, and so he and Vanessa will kind of update us on some of the organizational activities. So Lee and Vanessa, it's all yours.
Thank you, Ed, and good morning to those on the West Coast. Good afternoon to everyone. Welcome back. I hope you all did get some time last night to recharge. We had a great first day and looking forward to day 2 of our time together. As Ed said, Lee and I just wanted to give you a few administrative or operational updates like we've been doing over the past few meetings. 3 things that I have on my list is the charter, bylaws, and then bringing on new members. So just to start with an update on the charter, as you guys know, your committee charter lasts for 2 years and then has to be renewed. I want to assure everyone we're on track to get the charter renewed by its expiration date, which is September 30th. So as soon as we get the final sign off, we will be publishing a Federal Register notice so that the public is also made aware of the new charter. And of course, we will send a copy to all of you committee members just to share that and review it with all of you. But again, we're on track to get it renewed by September 30th, which is when the current charter expires. Lee, anything to add on the charter renewal?
One item related to that, as we have discussed in the past at length, there has been the expansion of the committee's role to be addressing maternal health. And so as part of the charter and the bylaws, we have worked to incorporate those changes to the mission. And if everything is signed off as expected, that will be reflected both in the content of the charter and the bylaws, as well as the title, which will mean a slight change to the title of the committee to include maternal.
Great, thank you. Next update on bylaws. We wanted to wait to submit the bylaws for approval so that they were consistent with any changes to the charter. So they have moved forward. So we were in process of getting the bylaws approved. And again, the language in that document should reflect any changes we had made to the charter. So we'll keep you updated on that and share them as soon as they're approved. And then the third item I just had was an update on bringing on new members. As you guys know, the charter allows 21 members to the Advisory Committee on Infant Mortality. So we have been working over last several months, almost a year, to get those remaining positions filled on the committee. And we are still waiting for the background vetting on our recommended nominees to be approved and fully vetted. So we hope to hear something before the end of the year. Lee, anything on this current package of nominees that we're waiting for full approval on?
Yeah, just I would imagine for committee members and for nominees, those of you who have gone through the process as committee members understand how long and tedious a process this is. We suffer internally with the same sets of difficulties with, we put out a call for nominations. It seems like 2 years ago, it probably is 2 years ago, and to get through this process, it's laborious both on your side and on our side. The final stage of this, for many of you who know, is once we've finally gotten the approval through the various chains, is to go through the ethics provisions as well, which are not generally saying, is a person a good ethical person or not? Rather to say, are there any conflicts of interest or financial issues that need to be either addressed or recused? So it is sort of a silent process because there are personal details that are being uncovered or reviewed through this, which is why it does seem a little shrouded and less than transparent. We are following all of the rules to the letter, which also includes us remaining rather silent on who has been nominated and not. For purposes of this particular round of nominees, for anyone that you may have nominated up to this point, if they have not been contacted by us for that first round of nominees throughout the process, they are not currently on the list. All of the people who are being considered for the round one set of nominees have been contacted, have been engaged, have received or has some back and forth with the ethics process. I did get a question from someone about a week ago who had been on that first list of nominees, and they had not heard yet. And I did let them know that if they hadn't received that input, then they weren't being considered for that round. That does not mean that for future rounds, we won't look back at the packages that have been submitted to us. So please be assured that that was just the first round of now 2 that are in the hopper. And we are saving all of those names for consideration. And we do remain open to other names for nominations. If along the way you feel there's somebody who would be particularly good, we do keep a running file of those nominees. That's all.
We had mentioned, there are some categories of people. We want some diversity, geographic and professional and age and, racial and all those kinds of things. Is there any way for you to sort of say, here's some categories that we would like some nominees for, just to be kind of proactive on that?
Sure. We have sliced and diced this in every possible way. We have lots of Excel spreadsheets looking at region of the country and professional expertise and gender and race and all sorts of categories. So we are trying to, and those are the requirements within the Federal Advisory Committee Act, that we make sure that it is our representation is diverse and comprehensive. Right now, we have been looking, just to give you an indication of what we're looking at, we have been looking at some of the expertise that is on the staff, that is on the committee, that is rolling off the committee. So if you look at the members who are leaving, the areas of expertise that they bring to the table now, we want to ensure that there are others who can continue in some of those discussions. I think from the pool of candidates and nominees that we have received, we can cover all of those bases, but we will reach out to you. And I believe, Ed, that Vanessa has reached out to you on a couple fronts just to make sure that we're covered with OBGYNs, we're covered with pediatricians, we're covered with nurse midwives, we're covered with people from the various regions of the country. And that will be a running dialogue with you all.
Right.
Just to add, I would say it was difficult to find, you guys had mentioned early career professionals, and I think we have different, you can just tell us how you defined early career, but I would say when we looked for people who were, let's say within their first 5 to 7 years of their career, I know you guys wanted that representation on the committee. I will remember in going through all of the packages we received, that was one of the categories that was a little more difficult to find submissions in. The other was we're always looking for more consumers or people from the community. There were several people, more than several, I would say, that have lived experience. But again, just looking for more of that consumer representative. Always happy to take more of those as well in the mix. Plenty of professionals and medical professionals, as you would imagine, came forward.
Magda, you had a question?
Well, thank you for helping us assure the continuity and strength of SACIM, how whatever the acronym will become. Two quick questions. One is, in this sense of rounds, how many do you anticipate onboarding if everyone said yes and by December? And in a second round, is the hope that by the time we complete, many of us, our tenure by June of this coming year, June, July, that we will be at a full complement of 21? I'm just looking at that sense of what's the end goal if this is a year of transition. So that's the first question. And the second question is a technical one. All of us need to be vetted still at regular intervals. It's not it's part of the price of admission. And to be honored to be here. Can you anticipate that we who currently serve will need to go through another round of ethical review prior to the end of our terms that may expire? And if there is a third, how many people stay on? And how many of us, of the few of us that are on this committee, will be leaving? If you could just give those 3 points, I think it would be helpful for us to have context for the transitions of the coming year. Thank you.
Vanessa, you want to go first?
Sure. If all nominees currently being vetted do get approved, it would be 9 new members coming on board. Of the current 10 of you that are on the committee now, if I'm remembering your term dates correctly, there are 7 of you that will roll off next either June, July, and 1 of you, I think that's September. So we're just looking at about 7 of you rolling off in the summer to fall of 2022. So that is the new package that Lee mentioned we're preparing and starting to think through, trying to backfill those 7 slots, as well as fill any remaining ones, since we didn't get a full set of 11 approved for this year.
So the goal is, as we're moving forward, the goal is to try to get to that 21. We are not allowed in the process currently to submit an extra one just in case someone falls off. That was something that we tried this year, but we failed at, knowing that the odds are that 1 or 2 are going to fall off through the year and a half long process that it takes, that somebody will either lose interest or have a career change, or for whatever reasons not make it through the vetting process. So our goal is, as we're moving forward, to achieve the full complement of members by the time we complete package 2. But we can't guarantee that that's going to happen. And the goal is to have both a staggering of members, because as Vanessa had said, there's a large portion of, actually the majority will be coming off, of the existing members will be coming off in the summer next year. So to try to stagger this so that it's a less dramatic change in the committee over time. On the ethics side, Vanessa, I don't have any information on whether or not a re-review is necessary between now and the end of the cycle
of their terms. I can follow up on that, Magda. You're right. It is an annual review now. So I'd have to ask ethics if any of you have a review coming up before the end of your term next summer.
Thanks for that. It just helps us to plan ahead so that we don't get caught behind and then we're being chased. So if we've got 1 more to go, please let us know.
Okay. And then Belinda had a question in the chat, and just so everyone's aware, if you couldn't see the chat, did we consider individuals with lived experience? Yes, definitely, and we'll continue to do so. And then if you do have recommendations, yes, please just send them to me. I can put my email in the chat if you guys don't already have it.
All right. Thank you very much, Vanessa and Lee. Anything else from your standpoint administratively?
There is one item that I just wanted to bring up with you. So the discussion yesterday about race concordant care, I thought was a really excellent discussion, and something that I welcome hearing the input from both the people that are brought in to be providing opinions and views, as well as weighing in from the various committee members and maybe where there is consensus on particular topics or on these issues. I would ask, as you're having some of those discussions, for purposes of us, and this goes back to one of the questions that was raised, and I'll use a word that wasn't used yesterday, around the traction that recommendations are making or not making as we work through the process of reviewing recommendations that are made. We are looking for every opportunity to gain traction with the recommendations that you have. And I do respect and appreciate the comments that Paul Wise had made around not just letting the bureaucratic process drive your recommendations and whether or not they're considered or not. So kudos to Paul for bringing that up and bringing back the point of traction. If there are particular topical areas where there is consensus from the committee or strong feelings with a small group on these very sensitive issues, it's helpful for us to hear what those are, and especially if there is consensus, to know that, and to consider what is good from different perspectives for purposes of the government to hear. On race concordant care, I think that's a very looming issue for all of us as to how we craft national policy around some of those topics as it relates to case law, as it reports to the way we fund grant programs, and as it relates to the types of incentives we provide or don't provide. So anything that you can direct us or give us your expert advice, it will be noted, recorded, and potentially used as traction for the policy recommendations that we're making. So thank you.
Good. Thank you for that. Appreciate that. Then let's move into the main session of this first part of our day, which is Indigenous health. As you know, when we were together in June, we made some recommendations. We included some recommendations in our overall package of recommendations to the Secretary around the Indian Health Service and Indigenous health. But in our discussion, we recognized that it was a much more complicated and complex issue than, and we had not taken the time to really look at all of the Indigenous health issues or go in depth on any of them. So we decided that over this next year, we would really do a deeper dive into the issues related to Indigenous health, particularly among moms and babies. And so we're going to be focusing on this and the first part of our session today. And I'm hoping that when we get together at our first in-person meeting, which I'm hoping will be in March, that we might even be able to do it on tribal land to really get some firsthand experience of what's going on in Indian country. But today we are going to really do a deep dive for a couple of hours, led by Janelle Palacio, who has been taking a lead in this, along with some other experts, other resources in this. But before we get started, when I was State Health Commissioner, whenever I met with tribal leaders, we always started with an invocation. And I found that it really set the tone, it set the stage for the meetings that we had, and they were much more productive. And I really appreciated that beginning of our meeting. So today we are going to start our session with an invocation. And I've invited Wakinyan Sky LaPointe, Sicano Lakota from Minnesota, which is Lakota for Land of Cloudy Waters. Wakinyan is an Indigenous human rights advocate and a co-convener of the Miniki-Wakan, or Indigenous Water Decade. He centers Lakota knowledge, language, and ways of life in his work advancing human rights. Particularly, he works in partnership with Indigenous peoples and with youth. And he's been particularly active in Indigenous water rights and water justice, and believes in the sacredness of water, and our connections with water are also sacred. Now, you will see shortly that just by age, he is not an elder, but he has been taught by his father, Lemoyne LaPlante, who has blessed him and given him permission to do these kinds of openings. And to be aware that Jackie Dion, who was my Indian Health Director at the Minnesota Department of Health, who is from the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa, offered tobacco to Wakinyan on behalf of SACIM as part of the invitation for him to come and do an opening invocation. So with that, Wakinyan, please welcome to SACIM, and we appreciate your words.
Thank you. Thank you. It's an honor to be here today to speak to all of you as part of SACIM and to touch on this important topic of the health of Indigenous mothers, infants, and their communities. At this time, what I always begin with is just some words in our language, especially Lakota language. In our way, we often say Wakanja, which means our children are sacred or the babies are sacred. When in our stories, when a spirit first touches down on earth, that is a ceremony in and of itself. When a spirit begins to breathe in this world, that's also wonia, the giving of life, the breath of life. And so in our way, we always say wichoyeki wakan, which means our words are sacred. They have the power to give life and they have the power to take life. And so I mention these things because, it relates to one Indigenous worldview of the Lakota people and how we perceive our children when they first come into this world. And it's by, ceremony. And so I want to say that importance of that, but also of the wiyan, the woman, the wiyan ke wakan, that are sacred. And it also relates to one of our words of iyan, one of the first creators in which gave all life to creation. And so we don't take this word lightly in a Lakota way. We often say we do not separate the creator from creation. Our spirituality is our reality. And so I want to offer a prayer here. And in Lakota language, what I'll do is I'll offer Chinshasha. And in our original stories, the spirit of Chinshasha, tobacco, traditional tobacco, spoke to us and told us how to pray with it, how to offer our prayers. And it was one of our first ceremonies as the Ocheti Shakoni, the 7 council fires. And so as I do this, I'm going to sing a song in our way. And it says that this offering is sacred. And this is what we say as we pray. And what we say will be heard by Tonkashla Wakantanka and our Unchi's grandfather, the creator, and our grandmothers. And so I always offer this as I begin these important conversations together. And we always do it as a community. So I want to say that piece. And I'm lighting sage here, Pejichota. And we offer this to cleanse Wopakintapi, which is to wipe ourselves down. Wipe Wopakintapi. And then Nahi Ije, to make our spirits whole. And often these are ceremonies too that are as old as time and go back since time immemorial. So with that, I have a pencil Chinshasha with me. And I'm going to sing this song. And again, ask that everyone pray together, offer their good hearts, their good energy from their minds together as one. We say Tawachi Wanji, not Tante Wanji, which is one mind and one heart. And with that, I'm going to go into this song. I'm going to offer a prayer in the Lakota language. Chicho welo, hey, Kala waya kaya, chicho welo, hey, wo ye wa kacha, chicho welo, hey, ina jia welo, hey. Kala waya kaya, chicho welo, hey. Cha sha sha wa ka cha, chichu welo, hey ya hina jia welo, hey yo. Takashla Wakantan Kawana, Lechia Wunspe, Omnaeki Ekta, Omniche Kile, Kti Wunglakapi, Na Toka Dakia, Washdewan Chimpi, Le Kagapi Te Okiapo, Cha Wakaija Dako Ota Washte Upikte, Na Toka Dakia Washdewan, Chankuluta Kileaka, Ona Hiksapa Mani Pikte Na. Inana ate okeapo unshilapo. Cha woksape umpikte okeapo. Wo chante na trawa chiwaste. Yoha pikte. We chozane na wachoni. We chakupo. Loko ich okan kiksuya pikte na koya. Oglaka pikte na. Wo prewa kanki. Ihakabia pikte okeapo. Wo plat kanka chichupelo. And so I offered this prayer in the Lakota language, praying for the mothers, for the fathers, for the babies, and for the children in this way with this Chinshasha. And I ask for this Wonachiksapa, the spiritual wisdom, this balance in the universe, the Woksape, this wisdom within ourselves, this collective wisdom that we hope for in everything that we do within this work. And on this red road, I prayed for these children, these babies that you seek to help, that they walk on this red road in a good way, remembering who they are in their own ways of life. And so I think that with that I want to conclude my part here and ask that you continue this prayer and this work that you do, because it's the stuff that gives meaning to it, why we do this work. And so with that, I'll conclude my part. Woplat Khanka, Ed, for having me on here, and it's been an honor.
Well, Kenyan, blessings to you. Thank you for your contribution. It adds a lot to our discussion. Appreciate your being with us. And I hope you can stay with us and listen to the conversation. And I now turn it over to Janelle to lead us in this really important session, as most of ours are, but this one in particular, given this time when we're thinking about vulnerable individuals, vulnerable families, and the moms and babies that walk the red path. So, Janelle.
Thank you. This day is particularly special that we were able to have Wakinyan to give an invocation to bless this work that we're doing. And I want you to know that this would not have been able to happen except for a law that was passed in 1978 that allowed Indian religious freedom, a year before I was born. So thank you. Today is Harvest Moon, as Ed brought up, and the first day of autumn equinox. We have days of equal, the length of day and night are equal. So it's very timely. We're at a point of transition as a committee, as a nation, with systemic racism, with COVID-19, and as members of a global community as we face climate change, which will have grave impacts on the most marginalized. David De La Cruz yesterday gave advice, and his advice was to be persistent and not give up, to not be satisfied with the status quo, and to keep pushing to be seen and heard. And that is what we're going to do today. We will start this panel with a visual storytelling of Native history. Following this, we will hear from Dr. Susan Stemler, a nurse midwife who has extensive experience with women's health, substance use, and Native health. She'll share her observations and perspectives as a nurse, midwife clinician, and a researcher reviewing IHS facilities. Following Dr. Stemler, we will hear from Dr. Linda Bain Frizzle, who will share with us her experience, her expertise on Indian health service systems. So I believe now I need to make, let's see. I think that we are all the way at the very end of my presentation. Chris, is there a way to fast track it to the very beginning? We'll just do all this.
Did you? I don't think we've received your presentation yet. I thought you were sharing.
Sorry, I'd be happy to share. And I'm looking at my screen, so I am about to share my presentation. Thank you. Okay. Hmm. Okay.
You should just need to click the share screen button down in the
Yep,
middle.
It's coming.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. Here we go. Hmm. Okay. Let's see. All right. Are you able to see the presentation now?
Yes, we are.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So I will begin because I know I spent a few minutes trying to upload everything. It's so much technology. And I want to share with you that this presentation is gigantic and I was not able to share it very easily. And this is a visual storytelling of Indigenous history, which is going to help background the context for our discussion later and for future conferences that we have. So Hesquex, good day everyone. Thank you for joining me today as I share how story work can help us understand and improve maternal infant birth outcomes among Native people. So this is a paper I published with some co-authors on how story is used for healthcare research. Following, here are the 3 key objectives for today's talk. Basically, we're going to talk about history. We're going to talk about adverse childhood experiences with historical trauma and how these theoretical frameworks can be applied to understand Indigenous health. Before I begin this presentation, I want to acknowledge the ancestral land which I'm standing upon right now. My feet are resting on shared ancestral Pomo and Coast Miwok land, and I'm paying homage to these ancestors and memories, but also paying respect to those who are still living here who were displaced by federal, state, and local policies. I encourage you to find out which tribal lands, ancestral lands that you reside on. That equity is justice and fairness is an underlying theme of this presentation. As you listen to this story, please ask yourself at different junctions if justice and fairness are present. Now I can begin. My name is Janelle Palacios. I'm Salish and Kootenai, and I grew up on Flathead Indian Reservation in Montana. I've been a nurse midwife for over 10 years, and before becoming a midwife, I collaborated with Native communities to understand teen pregnancy and parenting. I'm past president of the Native Research Network, and it's an Indigenous organization that has clinicians, public health researchers, and epidemiologists aimed at improving Indigenous health. So thank you for joining me today. The photo you see right here are of my great-grandparents, Olive and Ernest. They were married in 1926. Both were enrolled members of our tribe and grew up on a reservation. Both attended Indian boarding schools, which I'm going to discuss later. I have a high alert warning for this presentation. It's going to cover some materials that may be triggering. I will discuss systemic structural racism, forced sterilization, and genocide. This presentation has done its job if it promotes discomfort and causes tension, providing fuel for growth on an individual level, a team level, an organization, and finally among our larger US culture, as we recognize our nation's history. I will use story as a way to facilitate your knowledge of the importance of history and the effects we have on Indigenous health. I want you to know that the principles I am sharing today, the importance of understanding history, backgrounding life course, can be used across different communities, and I would argue essential to really understand health and well-being. To facilitate this understanding, I'm going to weave my family's story throughout. My hope is that after today's story work, you will challenge yourself to consider the importance of history and context as you carry on the work you do. Today, I will use the terms Indigenous, Native, Native American, American Indian interchangeably, and I'm going to limit most of this presentation to the lower 48 states. I want you to know that this is not, there are so many parts of Indigenous history that I was not able to include in this short period of time, and I encourage you to seek more information. I also want you to know that we are a strong people, we're resilient. The fact that we are still here shows that we are resilient despite all the hardships we've faced. Many of us know this. This is why we're here. We're talking about Black Indigenous women who die at higher rates than white women when they're pregnant or after they give birth. We know that education is not protective. And we also know that as Black and Indigenous women age, their outcomes are worse. Also, we know that among infants, sudden unexpected infant death syndrome, especially among Native people, are the highest. And if you were to look at where we have hotbeds of sudden unexpected infant death, you'll find that in many states where there's a high concentration of Native people, you'll find higher rates of SUIDs. We should all be familiar with this slide too, doing the work we do at Maternal Child Health. This is Dr. Liu's model to explain life course theory as it pertains to racial and ethnic differences. So in general, white women may experience less assaults over their lifetime and have more protective factors, while Black and Indigenous women are at risk of experiencing more assaults over their life course with fewer protective factors to mitigate the assaults, overall affecting reproductive and perinatal health. This should also be very familiar. This is a famous study that was done in partnership with the CDC and Kaiser Foundation, the Adverse Childhood Experiences, where we found that traumatic childhood experiences, and from subsequent research, we understand that as adults, that these traumatic childhoods have resulted in long-term negative health effects, such as smoking, alcoholism, drug use, suicide attempts, depression, diabetes, obesity, lots of issues. The theory states that as the number of adverse childhood experiences increase, so does the risk for negative health outcomes throughout their lives. This simple, amazing study should be taught, not just among clinicians and experts, but should be taught in schools and in larger, wider community circles. Like, this is just important information to know. I think that if people understood this, there would be more empathy. Adverse childhood experiences have lasting impacts on health and opportunity. Opportunity is a significant factor that is not always discussed, which I will address in this presentation. So the top QR code is a citation for this figure held at the CDC, and the bottom QR code is for you to take your own adverse childhood experience quiz via NPR's website. Evidence suggests that ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, affect fertility. So this study published in 2019 found that among 2,700 women in the UK, psychosocial adversity in childhood is a potential risk factor for single and recurrent pregnancy miscarriages. How do we apply these concepts to Native families? While in graduate school, I tried to unify historical trauma theory and a theoretical framing known at the time by Weathering from Arlene Geronimus, who talked about allostasis, which was really trying to get at what Michael Liu was also sharing in the life course work. And through Dr. Marie Yellowhorse Braveheart's extensive work on historical trauma, it helps us understand that historical trauma is the cumulative, multi-generational collective experience of emotional and psychological injury to communities and their descendants. These are traumas experienced by a specific culture, racial or ethnic group. It is related to major events that oppressed a particular group of people, including traumatic community-wide events like slavery, the Holocaust, forced migration, and violent colonization of Native Americans. The genesis of historical trauma comes from work directly with Holocaust survivors and their children. Historical trauma responses refer to the manifestation of emotions and actions, the behaviors that stem from this perceived trauma. So this was my 20-year-old something rendition combining theories that discuss current lived conditions backgrounded by one's collective community and family history. As the first few generations of a particular victimized group experienced traumatic events, responses were passed on to future generations. And today we now understand that trauma can leave a chemical mark on a person's genes, which can be then passed down to future generations. This mark doesn't cause a genetic mutation, but it does alter the mechanism by which the gene is expressed. This alteration is not genetic, but epigenetic. My work was trying to understand Native women's health in context of our history of traumatic events and also daily living and opportunities available. When I first published this study, I tried to talk about epigenetics and I had to retract it since there was just not enough evidence. I'm glad to say today we have much more understanding of this. Now, what is historical trauma? As I discussed, Dr. Braveheart defined historical trauma as the cumulative, multi-generational collective experience of emotional and psychological injury in communities and descendants. And in this collective experience across generations among Native people, I'm going to be speaking about general Indigenous history. So not specific to just one group of people, but just general in the United States as experienced by a collective group, such as colonization, assimilation policies, and sterilization. This figure, the authors described a model to understand cumulative health effects given historical trauma. This model produced by the CDC outlines methods in which ACEs, those adverse childhood experiences, influence health and well-being throughout the lifespan. And I was really happy to see that historical trauma was included in this model. So pictured above is the typical format when clinicians are reporting on a patient in a healthcare setting. So a 32-year-old Native American woman at 33 weeks gestation and 6-7 days, has hypertension and diabetes type 2, and this person has fetal demise. But this is what these cases look like when you look at the people behind them. These 4 women are women I know: my grandmother, my great aunt, my mother, and my best friend Tashina, for which I have placed my picture to stand in for her. 3 of these women were teen mothers, and combined, these women survived 9 preterm deliveries, 2 infant deaths, 2 fetal demises, a coerced sterilization, suicidal ideation, alcoholism, abusive violent relationships, countless rapes, near misses in being murdered, poverty, and daily encounters steeped in racism on a reservation that shares land with a known hate group. To receive better care, if you had money, a tank of gas, and reliable transportation, the choice to buy goods and services off reservation was always prioritized. One of these women chose to drive over 120 miles round trip to deliver her first child for fear of what she would encounter at the local hospital. So this presentation will discuss each of these women's experiences of maternal infant morbidity and mortality in terms of their life contexts, not their race, but their inherited histories, their launch in life, and the opportunities open to them in the life they lived. Their stories help frame our understanding of how powerful the background is really. So I'm going to start with history. For many of you, this will be their first in-depth contact with general Native history. Do not feel embarrassed. These histories are not widely taught in our public education system. Have you ever wondered what the world looked like before settlers arrived? Here is a map created by Victor Temprano, a Canadian artist, and he said, "I feel that Western maps of Indigenous nations are often inherently colonial. They delegate power according to imposed borders that don't really exist in many nations throughout history." When I look at this map, a few things stick out for me personally. First, I see that Indigenous groups moved and they occupied vast territories and they shared these territories, they coexisted. But also this map exposes some of my own internalized prejudice. Growing up in northwestern Montana, where some of my tribe, the Kootenai people, lived across the Canadian border, as parts of Canada were traditional lands that the Kootenai people lived on. I've always considered my cousins to the north family, but I was surrounded by messages that those from the south, such as Mexico, were not, were in fact, they very much a part of my Indigenous family, and the border crossed us. So in thinking back to the 4 women at the beginning of the presentation, how can we understand their maternal infant outcomes in context of their history? And does it matter? I would say it does. So before contact in 1492, the estimated conservative size of the Indigenous population was roughly about 60 million people, while in Europe it was between 70 and 80 million people. By 1600, the Indigenous population lost 56 million people due to diseases brought across from Europe. So in 110 years, we lost 10% of the global population. This is the largest human known mortality event by proportion. So for comparison, 80 million people died in World War II, but that only accounted for 3% of the global population lost. As westward expansion continued and treaty making was happening, the Indigenous people were removed from their homelands and pushed farther west. This slide shows the largest organized force removal by the US government in 1830 called the Indian Removal Act, which was supported by President Andrew Jackson and passed by Congress. Over 100,000 men, women, infants, and children were given a martial escort, traversing over 5,000 miles across land and water to the Oklahoma Territory and forced onto reservations. This death march was later named the Trail of Tears, and it's estimated that between 4,000 and 8,000 women, men, infants, and children died of cold, hunger, and disease during this winter death march. Prior to 1871, the US government had treaties with different tribes, and this is really important. It is because we have treaties that a number of tribes today have been able to maintain a special status with the federal government. So, in other words, in exchange for giving up our lands, ceding our lands, tribes were given smaller plots of lands, reservations, access to healthcare and education. Again, because my ancestors ceded our ancestral land and agreed to give up large portions of our traditional lands, my ancestors were relegated to reservations, imprisoned there oftentimes for one generation or more, and given meager resources to live off of. The alternative was to fight and die, and some tribes did this, and they forfeited their federal recognition. On this slide, you see the traditional lands of the Sioux, also known as the Nakota, Dakota, and Lakota people. Originally in green, you can see their traditional lands across the Midwest, and currently the reservations are much smaller in a few states, predominantly in North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, and Nebraska. It's a big change. This is just a visual representation showing you that land that was ceded or forcibly taken from the Indigenous people. In a span of 60 years, most of the land was gone. This is what it looks like today. The purple highlighting federally recognized tribes with reservations, and the tiny green speckles are those Indian reservations which are state only recognized, and they do not have special nation-to-nation status with the federal government. Next, let's talk about food sources. Bison were a traditional major food source for many Native people, and as you can see here, there were two types of bison, which I did not know. The wood bison, which are largely extinct now, and the plains bison. In a span of 50 years, from 1840 to 1880, the bison in North America dropped from 40 million to less than 400,000. And again, in 9 years, that number dropped to 541 free-ranging buffalo in the world, with about only 300 roaming in the US. Bison were directly targeted for sport, food, and to sell their hides. But the dramatic shift in bison population is largely attributed to the government policies aimed at eliminating this food source to weaken any uprisings, preventing tribes to unify and live together in large numbers. The sharp decline in available food source also created widespread starvation, and the government was able to more easily move tribes onto reservations, thus controlling food resources. This painting is named American Progress. Aptly named, as this allegory perfectly represents the Western view of progress. Lady Progress is seen moving from the enlightened and civilized East towards the dark, stormy, and wild West, chasing Indians and buffaloes to make way for American progress. To facilitate assimilation, the government enacted the Dawes Act of 1887. This gave male heads of households individual parcels of land to farm, but also allowed tribes for the first time to outright sell their land from reservation to non-Indians. So this shift in property ownership and ability to sell reservation land had disastrous results where much tribal land was lost and reversed in the 1930s by this policy. The Dawes Act was reversed in the 1930s by the Indian New Deal. So in general, the Dawes Act prompted the concept of westward expansion by promising land in return for settlement. But the act was primarily an attempt to handle increasing conflicts, separate Native people from tribal lands, and also try to force them to culturally accepting Western model of land ownership. And some tribes historically farmed, but many did not. And the concept of owning a piece of land was somewhat foreign, especially that an individual could own land and not share with the community. Additionally, the Dawes Act allowed the government to sell and give away land to settlers. This is an actual ad posted in 1911 by the US Department of Interior, advertising reservation Indian land. And if you look really closely, it was published in 1911, but in 1910, they had the approximate acres and average price per acre for Oklahoma, Oregon, South Dakota as selling points for 1911. So this slide represents the after effect of the Dawes Act. This is my tribe. So along with this act was the ability for both the federal government to sell or give away lands to settlers. This is essentially what happened on my reservation in Montana. My reservation is a patchwork quilt of land actually held by my tribe versus non-tribal settlers. The influx of Western settlers is also why the educational board and economic growth is heavily influenced by it, if not largely controlled by non-natives. So the green land is land held by my tribe, is largely forested land. The yellow land is typically non-Indigenous, it's non-Indian land, non-Indian owned land, and is typically farmland and also land around towns. What year was religious freedom founded in this country? Some might answer 1620 with the Mayflower, others might say 1791 with the First Amendment. But when did Native religious freedom actually happen? So 1978, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed. So the above image on the right is of a ghost dance, a religious ritual believed to drive away invading settlers and restore the indigenous people to their ancestral lands and way of life. This dance was banned as the government believed it would renew Native militancy and lead to violent rebellions. On December 29, 1890, in one of the final chapters of America's long Indian Wars, the US cavalry killed 146 Sioux at Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota in response to stopping the ghost dance from happening and spreading. Historians speculate that double the number of Sioux people were killed, and half speculated to be women, infants, and children, but their bodies were largely taken by family members for burial. The US 7th Cavalry lost 25 men. This district shows a mass grave following the massacre at Wounded Knee. And this painting done by Oscar Howe, a Dakota man, had a personal massacre, recalling how his own grandmother's stories had been shot in the hand by white soldiers. This painting was actually purchased as a gift for President Dwight D. Eisenhower. It's rarely seen. Next, I'm going to talk about boarding school experiences. Not long after reservations were formed and Indigenous people forced onto them, boarding schools were created. Oftentimes these were religious-based boarding schools that were federally funded to educate children, and one of the oldest Indian boarding schools was built in 1879, the Carlisle Indian School, located in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, ran by General Richard Henry Pratt, a Civilian War veteran. His motto was to kill the Indian, save the man. General Pratt believed that Indian savage were equal to Europeans, but that it was necessary to kill the savage, strip him of his language, culture, and family, and reinforce this with corporal punishment. Students were forced to cut their hair, change their names, stop speaking native languages, and convert to Christianity, and including corporal punishment and solitary confinement for any infraction of these rules. The approach was ultimately used by hundreds of other Native American boarding schools, some operated by the government and many more operated by churches. Carlisle was the model Indian boarding school for its time and became the template for federally funded Indian boarding schools, of which 26 more were modeled and spread across the country. Over 10,000 Indian children were held hostage here, representing over 140 unique tribes with their own cultures and languages. It was customary for children to be sent far away from their homes to deter them from escaping. Children were stolen from their families as young as age 4 and held against their will and their family's will until they turned 18 or 19. In the summer months, children were either stayed at the boarding school or were hired out to surrounding families in an ongoing effort to detribalize the youth. These photos are of Arapaho children, of when they entered the boarding school on the left, and then as they were beginning their assimilation on the right. Oftentimes, General Pratt had before and after photos taken to document successful assimilation. This is Tom Torlino, a young Diné Navajo teen who was captured and taken to Carlisle in 1882. The side-by-side comparison is of Tom's first day in 1882 and 3 years later in 1885. Publicity, propaganda. These photos documented the successful assimilation of the savage. This is a photo of my great-grandfather, Ernest. He attended Haskell Indian Boarding School until he enlisted in World War I. As time went on, sending children far away to boarding schools proved expensive and challenging. Challenging as Indian kids run away did not make a great headline. So Indian boarding schools were built on reservations. While these are not photos of my reservation, the Ursuline nuns operated the St. Ignatius Mission Boarding School, which was started in 1864. In 2011, 45 men and women stepped forward with allegations of sexual, physical, and emotional abuse from nuns and priests, with some of the victims were as young as age 5. So again, boarding schools, the Carlisle Indian Boarding School was established in 1879. Its policies were to assimilate. There was rampant abuse. It detracted from parental modeling, and these were traumatic experiences, ultimately leading to cultural destruction. Today, the U.S. Bureau of Indian Education still operates 4 off-reservation boarding schools. These schools aim to provide a quality education to students from across Indian country and empower Indigenous youth to better themselves and their communities. So the top link is the Digital Resource Center for more photos and information from Carlisle Indian Boarding School. And then the bottom link is actually to read stories from actual survivors from Carlisle Indian Boarding School, from the survivors and their family members. As young as age 4, look at the little kids in the front row, trapped for 15 years. The boarding school is not just a way to assimilate the future generation of Native youth, it was also a way to terrorize them and disrupt healthy family patterns. Children grew up without their parents and extended family, without healthy role models for what a functioning family looks like. Survivors of the boarding school era talk about returning to their homes, ill-equipped with the skills, language, and culture to function normally and healthily in their community. Over the past 30 years, survivors have come forward sharing their stories of abuse at the hands of adults in charge of them, but also fellow students. Verbal abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, violence, and more violence. 186 children's graves are at Carlisle. Survivors have shared their collective memories of murder and neglect. Children who tried to escape were hunted and sometimes killed. When reading historical documents, as I did, it's astounding to see the number of children who died while out on an outing. And you can read these documents for yourself. Over 4,000 children's bodies have been found in unmarked graves across residential boarding schools throughout the US and Canada. July of this year, 215 children's bodies were found at the Kamloops Indian Residential Canadian Boarding School, just north of Montana, with some of the youngest bodies found were 3 years of age. 250 children, some not even school age. Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland announced that a comprehensive review of the federal boarding school policies would be conducted via the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative, with preliminary reports expected April of 2022. Some would argue that as Indian boarding schools fell out of favor, placing Native children in adoption increasingly became the way in which children were assimilated and cultural destruction continued. Indian identity is complex and a hotly contested issue, both within tribes and on the state and federal levels. And one area where Indian identity has life-changing implication is when we look at children being adopted. In 2015, data across the US found that Native children are overrepresented than any other ethnic identity within the foster care adoption population. For every 1 white child, there are about 3 Native children in foster care. One last method to deal with the Indian problem was to assimilate Natives through 1950s policy called the Indian Relocation Act. This time, to assimilate Natives, the government took to terminating reservations by encouraging whole families to move to cities. Over 200,000 people were displaced or relocated to cities like New York, LA, Minneapolis, Chicago, Seattle, Oakland. This too proved disastrous, leaving entire families stranded in cities without promised support and lack of support to return to their communities. And some tribes completely dissolved. Today, 7 out of 10 Native people live in urban areas. So roughly 7 million people identify as Native, which is roughly about 2% of the US population. There are 574 federally recognized tribes in the US. In 2017, less than 1% of all US households were owned by Natives compared to 63% of white Americans. And in the same year, the median household income for Natives was about $40,000 versus $57,000 for the general population. And about 26% of Natives live in poverty versus 14% of the nation as a whole. The average poverty rate on a reservation can be ranging from 25 to 64%, depending upon the reservation. And for your reference, during the Great Depression, the poverty rate was about 25%. And during the pandemic that we're currently in, the August of 2020, the highest rate of poverty was 17.3%. Collecting data on Indigenous health is challenging and sparse. But in a CDC review from 2009 to 2011, we know that the top 3 killers among Native adults include heart disease, cancer, and unintentional injuries. Life expectancy is about 5.5 years less than the US general population. And the top 3 killers for Native women ages 1 through 19, unintentional injuries, suicide, and homicide. Violent deaths, unintentional injuries, homicide, and suicide account for 75% of all mortality in the second decade of life for Native people. Native Americans are the only ethnic group in the US that still require tedious record keeping to prove their identity. To determine who was eligible for land, the federal government required each tribe to create requirements to determine tribal membership. Keep in mind that tribes traditionally had dynamic values regarding identity. There were fur trappers and people historically captured during wartime that were given equal tribal status and membership. So the Western idea of linking blood quantum to identity, much as one would view the pedigree of a dog or a horse, was foreign. Nevertheless, this was strongly supported by the US government, which was supported at least 1/4 degree of that particular tribe's blood to be enrolled. As you can imagine, data collection among Native people is fraught with problems. What we really are trying to measure is experience, not race. And in Native communities with a dynamic colored population, light-featured Native people are at risk of experiencing similar historical trauma effects and ACEs, but their data may not be captured due to data collection flaws. So American Indian identity and tribal membership is sensitive. The Indigenous people who meet a degree of Indian blood do not have enough of any one tribe are not enrolled. And then there are those who grew up on the community with their culture, living the same lives, experiencing the same obstacles, but fall short of the blood quantum required for membership. So this paper captured Native Americans, the issues with data collection among Native Americans when we look at identity. And rather than asking someone, how much Indian are you? A better question would be, where are your people from? Or which tribe are you? But why is membership important? Because remember, membership is tied to access to resources, like land. This is a copy of a 1936 Indian census roll, which shows my great-grandmother, Agnes Irvine Dupuy, was a member of the Flathead tribe, and she had allotment 1010-670. This photo shows newly built HUD homes on my reservation. You're not seeing the HUD housing neighborhood I grew up in. But living on reservations has been likened to living in a developing country. Over 300,000 Native people are underhoused and are homeless. Over 30% of reservation housing is overcrowded, while only 50% of the same housing is connected to sanitation. 1 in 10 families have stable and reliable internet connection on reservations. 1 in 10 families have unreliable sources of clean, fresh water. And 1 in 3 reservation-based families live without plumbing. Another resource is access to the commods. This is from the food distribution program on Indian reservations, and these are actually also commodities that were given out to throughout the military. But beef with juices, a 5-pound block of mild cheddar cheese, peanut butter. I grew up eating this food. It was a staple in my household. And as food became scarce near the end of the month, meals became creative. My favorite was a spoonful of peanut butter dipped in crumbled, uncooked spaghetti sticks. So imagine what a high-fat, high-protein, high-sugar diet does to a body. Well, we have Indian Health Service to help us. In the 1950s, the Indian Health Service was created. Indian Health Service, or IHS, is split into 12 service areas. The largest IHS service area is typically Oklahoma, with roughly about 427,000 people. Unfortunately, it was at an IHS service site that a mass sterilization campaign was carried out upon Native women. In 1972, a woman entered a Los Angeles clinic requesting a womb transplant. She relayed a story of having her uterus taken out at an IHS facility. Similarly, 2 15-year-old girls went into an IHS hospital in Montana for appendectomies and were discharged with tubal ligations. Neither had been consented, nor their parents. After uncovering a number of anecdotal incidents, an investigation was conducted in 1976 by the U.S. General Accountability Office. This investigation only reviewed cases among 4 of the 12 IHS areas between 1973 to 1976. They uncovered that 3,406 women had been sterilized during this 3-year time period, and of these, 36 cases involved women under age 21, as young as age 11. It's not clear why the investigation did not include all 12 sites, nor why it only included a span of 3 years. Experts hypothesize that at least 25% and as much as 40% of the childbearing population at this time had been sterilized. Rounding, roughly about 70,000 women may have been sterilized in this period, while comparatively the rate of sterilization for white women was about 15%. Taking a woman's future reproductive capability without consent is an egregious human rights violation. And when targeting a specific population, it's considered genocide. While some sterilizations were desired, the massive sterilization campaign against this population started in the 1930s, spilling over to the 1980s, spanning 50 years. Some boarding school survivors have come forward with their own stories of forced sterilization before leaving the school. But maybe we should extend this timeline to today, for it continues as my cousins on the border are being held captive, abused, and traumatized, and their reproductive features have been taken from them. Native American women and girls face a high chance that they will experience violence and possibly be abducted and murdered. In 2016 alone, 5,712 Indigenous women and girls were reported murdered or missing. 84% of Indigenous women have experienced violence in their lifetime. 56% have experienced sexual violence. And on some reservations, Indigenous women are murdered 10 times the national average. Murder is the 3rd leading cause of death for Indigenous women. 96% of rapes are perpetrated by non-Native men, but non-Native offenders are rarely prosecuted on tribal lands. It is a travesty that any life is lost. And certainly Gabby Petito's murder is horrific, but the amount of attention to one woman in itself is a disparity, while little to nothing is shared about Black, Indigenous, women of color, and girls who are being murdered and go missing every day. The most recent contemporary issue Natives face is COVID-19, and this is Abigail Echohawk. She's the director of Seattle's Urban Indian Health Institute. Abigail requested assistance from the local, city, county, state, and federal programs when COVID hit. They simply requested protective equipment, gloves, and masks, and they were sent cadaver bags. When we turn to incarceration rates, the highest rates are among people of color. This data is old, it's 10 years old, but likely remains true today. And when you look at each state's incarceration rate by race and ethnicity, there are several states where Native people, men, women, and children are incarcerated at higher rates than any other ethnicity. This is an example of Montana. So Native people make up about 6% of the general population, but compose 22% of the prison and jail population. This happened a little over a year ago. Women were racially profiled and then their addresses were checked to see if they lived on or near a reservation. No matter if the tribe had not had one case of COVID, the newborn was separated from its mother by hospital policies that still have not been clearly shared. This was going to be the last slide. And then this happened. This is triggering. From a recent published review, the top 3 causes of Indigenous maternal mortality are hemorrhage, cardiomyopathies, and hypertensive disorders. Again, these known factors are just known facilitators of maternal mortality, but likely reflect these women's lives. There's too little data to determine if homicide and suicide are large factors, but my suspicion is that it will vary depending on where you draw your data from. Finally, in this report, substance use was not reported as a factor. So these are the general themes for risk for preterm birth among Native women. Again, there are implications from history and current conditions, and access to healthcare has consistently been a barrier. A recent study published found that Native women travel significantly farther to access OB care, and in particular, more complex OB care than white women living in similarly rural areas. Native women are 20 times more likely to give birth at a facility that lacks an OB unit compared to white women. A final word on trauma. I'm going to skip this slide. The effects of historical trauma and adverse childhood experiences along the life course can be manifested in many ways, and trauma is ongoing. It seems to not quite end. Among Natives, it has included the trauma, has facilitated a breakdown of traditional Native family values, alcohol, substance use as self-medication, depression, anxiety, suicide ideation and suicide attempts, child abuse, neglect, and domestic violence, post-traumatic stress disorder, general loss of meaning and sense of hope, and self-hatred. While this was a challenging presentation to hear, I want you to know that these stories must be heard and understood in order to effectively address the health disparities among Native people. I want to thank you for your participation and openness to listening and learning more about Indigenous health history. And with this, again, my hope is that you will take this history as an example of how it can be applied to other populations. It's knowing, it's being like a global citizen, a global, someone who is aware of history to help understand other people's experiences. And when we understand history and experiences, we can try to make changes for the betterment, which is why I've advocated for large-scale changes. Thank you. I will now pass the baton to Dr. Susan Stemler. And I just want to share with you all that Dr. Stemler is just a moment, pulling up all sorts of different things. I apologize for this. My screen is not working on my end. So Susan, Dr. Stemler, I would like you to go ahead and present yourself so that we don't lose any time. Thank you. Dr. Stemler, are you there? So I'll go ahead. Dr. Stemler is a nurse midwife and a researcher. She's a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. She is a certified nurse midwife, and she is retired faculty of California State University of Dominguez Hill School of Nursing. Dr. Stemler completed her undergraduate work in nursing at the University of Oklahoma Norman, and she earned her MPH and PhD in nursing at UCLA. She completed a postdoc fellowship at UCLA School of Medicine, Department of Family Medicine Center for Behavioral Addiction Medicine. Dr. Stemler's research interests involve women's health, substance use, American Indian health. She has focused her attention to developing pragmatic clinical interventions for use with methamphetamine using pregnant and postpartum mothers. As a women's health care specialist, she has worked as a clinician and administrator of community clinics in Los Angeles County. And she has acted as a maternal child health consultant in international settings. Welcome, Dr. Stemler.
I know Dr. Stemler was on before, but it doesn't appear she's on now. Would it be possible for Dr. Bain Frizzle to go first while we figure out where Dr. Stemler went?
Yes. Thank you for letting me know. That would be wonderful. Dr. Linda Bain Frizzle, if you're there, you're welcome to go ahead and present and start your presentation.
Okay, commonly pronounced Frizzell, but I understand. Okay, I'm going to share a screen, see if I can get my PowerPoint pulled up. Okay, can people see that?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to go into presentation mode so it shows a little bit bigger. How does that work for you? Okay.
We're-
See heads nodding and that.
Yeah.
Okay. It was really hard to cram all the information I really like to share with you into this short time period. But learning from my students, I've been at the University of Minnesota for going on 6 years now. The information I'll share is necessary for them to build a foundation so that they can improve their education and understanding of how things are in Indian country. So with that in mind, I have general